In April 1975, helicopters lifted the last remaining Americans off a few besieged rooftops in Saigon. To understand how the world's most powerful military ended up scrambling to escape a country the size of New Mexico, we have to look decades before the first American combat boots hit the ground. For nearly a century, the region was French Indochina. Paris extracted rubber, coal, and rice, administering a colonial system that taxed destitute farmers and strictly suppressed Vietnamese nationalist movements. Operating from remote mountain caves along the Chinese border, a charismatic revolutionary who adopted the name Ho Chi Minh organized a highly disciplined guerrilla force known as the Viet Minh to fight for independence. During the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh actually worked closely with American intelligence agents to fight the occupying Japanese military. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho declared Vietnam an independent nation, standing before a massive crowd in Hanoi and deliberately quoting the American Declaration of Independence. But Washington prioritized its alliance with Paris, turning a blind eye as French troops returned to reclaim their empire. That effort ended in a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, after a brutal 57-day siege, the Viet Minh overran the French garrison. Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap achieved this victory by mobilizing local porters to drag heavy artillery pieces piece by piece through rugged mountains, trapping over 15,000 elite French troops in an ever-shrinking perimeter. The fall of Dien Bien Phu forced France to abandon its colony, but rather than ending the violence, it shifted the conflict from an anti-colonial rebellion to a geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet bloc. In July 1954, delegates from the world's major powers gathered in Switzerland to draft the Geneva Accords. The treaty established a ceasefire and drew a provisional line across the map at the 17th parallel, splitting the country in two. Ho Chi Minh consolidated a communist state in the north. In the south, a staunchly anti-communist politician named Ngo Dinh Diem took control of a Western-backed republic, eventually canceling nationwide reunification elections with American support. Over the next decade, a southern insurgency grew against Diem's government. The United States sent military advisors, money, and weapons to prop up the South. Then, in August 1964, the USS Maddox reported taking enemy fire off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. Initial reports claimed a second, unprovoked attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats 2 days later. However, the radar operators and commanders on site quickly cast doubt on the data, advising Washington that poor weather and overeager sonar operators likely manufactured the phantom enemy vessels. President Lyndon B. Johnson ignored those caveats. He treated the second attack as absolute fact, pushing Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. That resolution granted the president the authority to use all necessary military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. By early 1965, the United States initiated Operation Rolling Thunder. Over the next 3 years, American aircraft dropped roughly 1 million tons of bombs and missiles on North Vietnamese supply depots, railways, and factories. But air superiority could not secure the ground in South Vietnam. On March 8th, 3,500 U.S. Marines waded ashore at Da Nang, crossing the line from advising the South Vietnamese army to actively fighting the war. To deny the enemy their protective jungle canopy, the U.S. Air Force launched Operation Ranch Hand. Aircraft sprayed approximately 19 million gallons of tactical herbicides, most notably Agent Orange, destroying massive swaths of forest and rural crops. The primary target was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a redundant network of dirt roads bypassing the border through Laos and Cambodia. Despite relentless bombardment, porters kept the route open, moving tons of weapons and troops south every day. For the American infantry units on the ground, engaging this enemy meant navigating a lethal environment. The Viet Cong constructed hundreds of miles of underground tunnel systems, like the massive complex at Cu Chi, allowing them to strike suddenly and vanish. The jungle floor itself was laced with sophisticated booby traps, tripwires connected to unexploded artillery shells, and hidden punji pits. Over 25% of American casualties came from these hidden explosives and traps, subjecting young soldiers to constant psychological strain with every step they took. The American military possessed the most devastating industrial firepower on the planet, but it was fighting a highly adaptable, decentralized force whose primary objective was simply to outlast the occupation. In January 1968, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars abandoned their rural guerrilla tactics and launched the Tet Offensive, a massive, coordinated surprise attack on dozens of cities and military bases across South Vietnam. On a tactical level, the assault was a disaster for the Communist forces. They failed to hold major targets, their ranks were decimated, and the civilian uprising never materialized. Yet the offensive exposed a massive credibility gap in the United States. For months, Washington assured the public the enemy was exhausted. Now, television networks were broadcasting brutal, chaotic street battles straight into American living rooms. The sheer scale of the attack destroyed public confidence in the war effort. The Tet Offensive proved that no area of South Vietnam was secure, breaking the political will of the American public to continue the fight. Under mounting domestic pressure, the United States began a slow withdrawal. In a final attempt to force North Vietnam into a settlement, President Nixon ordered the 1972 Christmas bombings, dropping 35,000 tons of explosives on northern cities in just 12 days. Weeks later, the factions signed the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement allowed for the complete withdrawal of American forces, but it left the fragile South Vietnamese government highly vulnerable to the heavily armed North Vietnamese troops still positioned within its borders. Without American air support, the Southern military collapsed. In April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, unifying the country under communist rule. The 2 decades of fighting left approximately 3 million Vietnamese people dead. The collapse of the Southern government triggered a massive refugee crisis as hundreds of thousands of people fled across the ocean to escape retaliation. The instability violently spilled across borders. The secret American bombing campaigns and subsequent destabilization of Cambodia paved the way for the rise of the Khmer Rouge and the horrors of the killing fields. At home, the war cost over 58,000 American lives and fractured the public's trust in its own institutions. It left a generation of veterans grappling with physical and psychological scars from an unwinnable conflict. The Vietnam War demonstrated the absolute limits of superpower intervention. It proved that immense industrial might and technological superiority cannot secure a victory when a nation misjudges the history, the culture, and the unyielding resolve of the people it is fighting.